get some important information, both locally and as it's happening at the national level. So as many of you have probably seen, we know that in 2020, the number of hate crimes in the United States increased to the highest level in over a decade. Law enforcement agencies reported to the FBI 7,759 such crimes. That was an increase of 25%. We've seen a similar kind of increase here in New England. We know that across the New England states, all have experienced a rise in those. And in response, the FBI has really put together an enormous number of resources and thought hard about how to address those issues, and has launched a campaign to encourage people reporting such incidents. And you've probably seen, as I have, on the highways, the billboards, heard the public service announcements encouraging people when they either are victimized in this way or happen to see something to make a report of that. And that increase mirrors what we have seen here in Middlesex County. We know that between the end of April of this year and today, we've received 46 reports of incidents. The majority have been based on race, with smaller numbers based on religion, sexual orientation, and sexual identity, in that order. And we are continuing to collect and monitor that, and we now have a sufficient number that we can start populating that map that we're creating of all of our 54 communities. So you will be able to go on and look at your own community and see what's being reported there, what kind of incidents we're having. And today we have the opportunity to, first of all, talk about the definition of a hate crime in Massachusetts, how such crimes are prosecuted at the state level, both by district attorney's offices and the attorney general's office, and then at the federal level by the FBI. And you'll also learn a great deal about those FBI community efforts that is partnering with stakeholders and residents to both increase awareness and decrease the prevalence of these incidents. We have really distinguished speakers here with us this afternoon. First up will be Dan Harren, who's an assistant district attorney in our office. Dan began working in this office as a law student in 2007, and upon graduating from law school, came and joined our office beginning in the district court and is now assigned to the Lowell Superior Court trial team. He investigates and prosecutes major felonies, including gang violence, robberies, aggravated assaults, sexual assaults, and murder cases. He also conducts numerous trainings for police and prosecutors on a variety of topics, and particularly in the last year or so around the issue of hate crimes. Dan's done a lot of work in this area, prosecuted a lot of these cases. Joining Dan with a state perspective is John Burke, an assistant attorney general in the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office. That division is obviously responsible for enforcing the Commonwealth's civil rights and anti-discrimination statutes and other laws protecting against hate crimes and bias-motivated conduct. John works on initiatives and enforcement actions addressing that kind of behavior in a variety of areas, particularly around housings and schools. And you may have seen just last week, we partnered with some of our legislative partners as well as with the Attorney General's office to testify in support of bills that would strengthen and clarify the state hate crime statutes. We're also joined today by Matthew Jacoby, who serves as the Boston Division's Assistant Special Agent in charge of the White Collar Crime Branch. And that branch covers public corruption, civil rights, healthcare fraud, complex economic crimes, and corporate and security fraud. Agent Jacoby has been with the FBI since 2004. He has had a variety of experiences in a number of offices across the country, including Philadelphia, Buffalo, and as well as working as the Rochester resident agent. In October of 2018, in May of 18, He was appointed the director of the Buffalo Regional Computer Forensic Lab. And a year later, he was selected as the unit chief of the high-tech organized crime unit, where he led the Joint Criminal and Opioid Darknet Enforcement Team, a multi-agency intelligence initiative which targeted online illicit drug trafficking. And so he brings to the investigation of these crimes, which are increasingly happening online, have some kind of a web component, a lot of that great experience. Joining Special Agent Jacoby is Supervisory Agent Heidi Kelsch, who has been a special agent with the FBI since 2004. During that time, she has primarily worked on counterterrorism investigations, including being a case agent for the first material support to terrorism case in the District of Massachusetts, and then being a part of the Boston Marathon Trial Task Force and Trial Team. Special Agent Kelch became a supervisor for the squad in 2020, and she oversees a variety of programs ranging from training to recruiting to community outreach. In addition, she serves as a supervisor for the crisis negotiation team, which she's been a member of for 13 years, and a coordinator of the EAP program at the FBI. So as you can see, our speakers bring a variety of experiences and specialties in areas that all impact the investigation and prosecution of these cases. So we're going to begin with Dan to talk a little bit about the state investigation and prosecution of hate crimes. Dan? Dan, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right.
Should be able to share your screen, Dan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I did freeze a little bit as Marion was talking, so hopefully that doesn't happen while I'm giving my presentation. I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview today of the hate crime laws that we have in Massachusetts. I do training for law enforcement, both prosecutors and police officers, where we get into a little bit more of details, but I just want to give an overview today of the lay of the land in Massachusetts when it comes to what a hate crime is. So these are the topics I'm just going to talk about really quickly and not dive into too much detail. The first one here, what is a hate crime, I think is an important thing to remember. There are oftentimes something happens, it's offensive, it is something that's bothersome to people. People feel like it should be a hate crime. And we actually have a definition in Massachusetts that the legislature has given us for what a hate crime is. It's a kind of a bit of a meaty paragraph, so I've broken it down here and paraphrased a little bit. But number one, we're talking about a crime. Someone being rude, someone being ignorant, someone doing something that's just generally offensive, while it may not be something that we want people to do, it may be upsetting and concerning to people. If it's not a crime or a criminal act, then it's not a hate crime. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that that crime has to be interwoven with it motivations of bigotry and bias. And the legislature broke down 3 clauses or 3 kind of general groups that you see here on your screen, including threats, attempts, or acts at a particular group of people. On the next slide, I'll show you the group of people that the legislature included in that first clause. But when they did it, they have a specific group of people they included in that, protected classes, I should say. The second 2 has to do with constitutional rights. So whether it's depriving someone of their constitutional rights through threatening them, intimidating them, or interfering with someone's constitutional rights. So when we talk about constitutional rights, we talk about personal freedoms, security, the right to walk around down the street, the right to be secure in your home, the right to do things like that that are fundamental in both our state and federal constitutions. So that is what a hate crime boils down to as the law is currently written. There are a number of bills that have been filed by a number of different groups and legislatures, but this is what is currently on the books at this time. These are the protected classes in the first clause. The last two, gender identity and sexual orientation, were added in 2012. So pre-2012, they were not included in that group of classes. There would always be an argument that it fell under the constitutional rights that they have. So for the first group, these are the protected classes enumerated in the statute. And for the second two clauses, it's those constitutional rights that are fundamental that are protected. There are, in addition to any crime that has these other elements with it, so any crime that's motivated by bigotry and bias, and it's one of these three groups, there are three specific hate crime statutes in Massachusetts. The first one is what we refer to as violation of constitutional rights. And I have here the basic elements for this statute. And so where it says no person, whether or not acting under the color of law, what that really means is it applies to everyone equally. It applies to law enforcement, it applies to private citizens, it affects everyone. So anyone could violate this statute. That someone who uses force or the threat of force. So you have to violate the statute, do something with force, even slight, towards the person of another. So just saying something offensive to somebody, doing different things that doesn't require the use of force or the threat of force would not be a violation of this statute. But on the flip side, potentially using force or threatening force would be a violation of the statute. You need to do it willfully. When we talk about willfully in Massachusetts, that's your objective, your goal, you're intending to do it. It's not just something that ends up happening. And you have to do so to oppress, threaten, or interfere with someone's exercise or enjoyment of a constitutional or statutory right. So this is, even though it's called violation of constitutional rights, the most encompassing of the hate crime statutes we have, because where I was talking about the definition of hate crime before, the first clause, we had that explicit group of individuals. And then in the second two clauses, we had constitutional rights. This protects any state or federal constitutional or statutory right. So it's going to be the most encompassing. So if you have the combination of these four elements, then you would have a violation of constitutional rights. The other kind of main statute that we see charged a lot, and one of the three that we have for specific hate crimes in Massachusetts, is assault or battery for purpose of intimidation. So an assault is when someone engages in menacing conduct that leads a person to believe they're in danger of being hit or being struck, or assault or battery. A battery is when someone is actually struck. So if you engage in conduct where someone thinks they're about to be touched, their body is about to be touched, or if you actually complete a touching of someone else's body, those are two different ways that you could violate the statute. The other has to do with damaging the personal or real property of another person. So that is the first part. The second part is with the intent to intimidate that person. So for violation of constitutional rights, where it's to oppress, threaten, coerce somebody to interfere with their constitutional rights, the actions of the person here has to be to intimidate the person. And the intent to intimidate the person has to be because of their race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So this isn't as encompassing as all the constitutional rights or all the statutory rights that we have, both from federal statutes and state statutes. It's limited to that group of individuals. A key thing with both of these two statutes, violation of constitutional rights and assault or battery for purpose of intimidation, is that someone being of a protected class cannot be secondary to the action. So just because someone attacks someone who's in a particular protected class doesn't make it automatically a violation of one of these two hate crimes. There has to be a connection that the action the person took was because that person was part of the protected class. So because you are shoveling snow and you shovel out your your spot in South Boston and someone comes and parks there, and then you get into a fist fight with them, just because that person was part of a protected class doesn't make it a hate crime. If in the course of attacking that person, you interject racial animus or other types of things towards the person, that can elevate it to a hate crime. So we have to, as prosecutors, be able to show the link that it's not just there was a crime that occurred, but that the crime occurred because of the person being part of the protected status. The third statute that we have in Massachusetts specific to hate crimes is destruction of a place of worship. So when people willfully and intentionally, or if they do it wantonly without cause, meaning you either intend to go destroy something, or you're so reckless in how you do it, you really are indifferent to the fact you're going to destroy it. But if you destroy, deface, what they call mar or injure a church, synagogue, or other building or place for purpose of memorializing the dead, or if it's a educational, school, or community center on grounds by any of those places, a church, synagogue, or other building or structure, someone who defaces that property can be prosecuted for a hate crime. And there's a thing called the soap and water defense, where even if with soap and water you can wash away the defacing of it, then it can still be prosecuted here. It doesn't need to be permanent damage. And it applies not only to those religious institutions that are listed, but also on the grounds on there. I've given this training at Holy Cross, and the example I give is that if someone were to deface the community student center on the grounds of Holy Cross, it could potentially be a violation of this statute, because it is a building on the grounds adjacent to a church, because there's a church on the campus. So that's an example of how this statute can be used. Connected with this statute is threatening to destroy one of those places. So it is a specific crime if someone threatens to destroy any one of these places, a church, synagogue, or other place or structure for worship. Those are the three. I know the last one was broken down into two, but I did it just for simplicity's sake. The three so-called hate crime statutes that we have in Massachusetts. That doesn't mean that any other crime can't be a hate crime, because if you think back to the beginning when I gave you the definition of a hate crime, it's any criminal act. So we have other crimes on the books in Massachusetts that could be a hate crime. On your screen are example of some. It's not limited to this. So it can be a hate crime if you have a crime, and then those other categories that I gave you. The other thing I'm just going to put in here, because it comes up a lot with these, is protected speech. This won't be a First Amendment presentation, but you hear a lot of times people say, oh, well, I have First Amendment rights, it's protected. When someone uses words to violate a statute or to commit a crime, it is no longer protected as First Amendment speech. So that's an important thing to remember. There are times when speech is protected, but if the speech is used as part of the commission of the crime, it is not protected by the First Amendment. And if anyone has any questions, this is my contact information.
Thank you, Dan. I don't know if we have seen John. Oh yeah, here's John. I see John. Thanks, John. I already gave you a glowing introduction, so thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks very much. Sorry about that. I got stuck
That's
on
okay.
something that ran long, just like
That's
everything
okay.
does these days. Okay,
Be able to share your screen, John.
sure. Here, I'm just going to put up the slides that I usually use for these. All right. How are we doing? Can everybody see the screen now, or are we? Yeah. Okay. So similar to Dan, this is a presentation that we usually use for law enforcement here, and I'm going to have it on in the background. But it's most. I'm going to cover the material at a fairly high level. Primarily, what I want to do is just give you an overview what the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office does in this area, separate from what the district attorneys do with the hate crimes prosecutions. So again, I'm John Burke from the Civil Rights Division. Civil Rights Division has a responsibility for enforcing all of the Commonwealth's civil rights laws and anti-discrimination laws. And that covers everything from what I'm primarily going to focus on today, which is the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, which deals with bias-motivated threats, harassment, and violence, to discrimination in housing, education, public accommodations, employment, and most other areas. So at the beginning there, Dan, gave you a pretty good definition of a hate crime. And I think something that's important and something that comes up when we talk about these things is the distinction between a hate crime and a bias incident. As Dan said, hate crimes are particular unlawful acts. And the reason that the AGO thinks the MCRA is so important is it covers a lot of conduct that is harmful both to victims and communities, but maybe doesn't qualify as a hate crime, right? So if we think of all of the bigoted and problematic behavior that people get up to, hate crimes, the type of conduct that qualifies as a hate crime, is maybe only one small part of that. The statutes simply don't reach the entire universe of bias-motivated threats, violence, intimidation, and other problematic behavior that's out there. And what the MCRA does is give us a tool that allows us to reach some of that other problematic behavior, support victims, support victimized communities, and try to cut off that problematic conduct. So the MCRA prohibits any person in Massachusetts from interfering or attempting to interfere with any right secured by state or federal law through the use of threats, intimidation, or coercion. So it sounds vaguely similar to the violation of constitutional rights that Dan talked about, but we're going to go over how it's broader than that. I should point out there is no bias component in the statute itself, right? So the statute as it's written allows both private individuals and the Attorney General's office to bring cases for MCRA violations. The Attorney General's office only uses the statute as a matter of policy in situations where there is a bias indicator, right? Where there's some part of what's going on indicates that somebody's civil rights or rights under anti-discrimination laws are being violated. You will see a lot of other cases where there are neighbor-on-neighbor disputes about people dumping leaves into each other's yards, for example, where they bring private cases under the MCRA. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about state enforcement and civil prosecution of the statute. That said, we use it in a lot of ways. Most recently, we've been using it as a tool with voter intimidation. A lot. Historically, we've used it where there's been discriminatory harassment between neighbors, between landlords and tenants, and in situations around access to reproductive health care facilities in particular. Like I said, we as an office only use this to get at discriminatory conduct. That said, our definition of what amounts to bias-related conduct or discriminatory conduct is very broad. We take a look at the entire situation, everybody's activities, everybody's histories, and it's like I said, because it's a discretionary requirement, it's flexible. And what we're really looking at is there a connection here to some sort of bias, prejudice, hate? And when we're doing that, there are a whole bunch of factors that we're looking at. I will say that the one that we prioritize above others is victim and witness reports, right? Not only because we find that they're independently important, but they tend to build on all of the other factors that we're looking at. So when a victim or witness reports something to us, they're generally already taking into consideration all of the other things that we're already looking at: the history of the people involved, what the person's been up to in the past, differences between the aggressor and the victim. All of that sort of is built into a victim and witness perception. So we use these, we bring MCRA actions both in situations where there is an associated criminal prosecution, and there's a lot of benefits that go along with that to the DA's office and the police and the community, mostly related to the fact that because these are civil cases, they move more quickly. We're able to get protections in place much more quickly than in criminal prosecutions. And in some situations, the type of protections that we can put in place for victims are actually broader and more flexible and can be more responsive to a situation than what you can get through a criminal prosecution, which sort of has only a limited number of consequences for the offender. We also bring these cases as standalone cases in situations where, for whatever reason it may be, a criminal prosecution can't or shouldn't be brought. And that's either because the conduct involved just doesn't satisfy a criminal statute, or there's something about the incident, the offender, or the victim that makes it seem like a criminal prosecution is not the appropriate remedy. I don't want to get into the sort of weeds too far on what qualifies it as an MCRA violation. I think the takeaway, and we would be happy if everybody had the understanding that it's quite flexible. And if you look primarily at coercion, which is one of the violations, it's very broad. It's essentially forcing somebody to do something that they otherwise would not have done of their own free will. Is coercion. Intimidation, threats are more narrow and more obvious, but coercion, sort of a basic normal understanding and definition of the term, is fairly broad, and the courts have been interpreted it in some cases even more broadly. And because these are cases that the state brings in the state's own name, so when we bring these cases, it's not, victim versus aggressor, it's the state, Commonwealth of Massachusetts against the aggressor. There's quite a few benefits to that. And there's quite a few differences, like I mentioned, between civil prosecution and prosecution for criminal violations. Some of the most important, I think, and striking are, I don't need a physical threat, or even a confrontation. People don't have to have been even face to face for us to bring an MCRA case and be successful. Because these are civil cases and civil prosecutions, the normal rule applies, which is you are responsible for the consequences of your actions. We don't need to prove that you intended to violate the law or you intended to bring about any particular consequence. They're general intent cases. And I think one of the things that's particularly important to us and has become an important issue in the past is, because we're bringing these cases as the state, we don't necessarily need a victim to step forward and be the face or to identify themselves as the person who's been victimized here. The question is, did what the defendant do, or the aggressor or the offender do, violate the MCRA as judged against the standpoint of a reasonable citizen in Massachusetts? So if a reasonable person would have been threatened, intimidated, or coerced in the exercise of any of their protected rights, that's enough for us to get relief put in place. We're talking about these, like I said, it's in some cases similar to the violation of constitutional rights statute on the criminal side. In the same way, though, the MCRA covers any protected right, and any is very broad. There's very little that people get up to, particularly in public, that is not protected by some state or federal right in Massachusetts. So if you go into a grocery store, Massachusetts public accommodation statutes protect your rights to go in there, go about your business without having it interfered. If you're in a park, similar. If you're at your job, similarly, right? So the issue in these cases is generally not was what happened here interfering with a protected right. That prong is exceedingly broad and fairly easy to satisfy. And then in terms of what, what's the point of this? What do we get at the end? We get something that looks like a harassment protection order, except much more extensive and broad. So again, because the state is bringing these cases, the relief is not specific to the victim. So we will get, I'm just going to jump ahead here. We're going to get the offender, the defendant is going to have to stay away from the individuals involved, where they go to school, where they work, where the incident took place, and even in some cases, entire sensitive areas. So we've had a number of these cases come up in the past, and where people were targeting gay bars, and the MCRA injunction that is put in place would require them to stay away not only from the bar in question, but broadly any place that is likely to be identified as somewhere where LGBTQ people are going to gather across the state of Massachusetts. And so if the incident occurred in Provincetown, there may be protections in place for people in Springfield or Pittsfield as well. They're going to prohibit the person from threatening, intimidating, or coercing, and not only the victim, but all similarly situated people. So again, if this is a race-based incident, it's gonna not only protect the victim of the race-based incident, but it's gonna protect, if the incident was targeted against, let's say, I'm trying to think of a recent case. We had a case involving a recent immigrant from South America. It was targeted at identifiably South American group of people, so it would protect against any similarly situated people. And it's also going to prohibit the person involved from coordinating with anybody else to carry out similar stuff, which is very helpful in cases involving organized groups. And then, like I said at the beginning, the MCRA is just one of our tools. We also enforce laws that prohibit discrimination and harassment in education, particularly K through 12 schools, in housing between landlords and neighbors, in employment, and in public accommodations, which for our purposes is generally pretty much any store in Massachusetts. And that's important because, again, it just broadens the type of activity that we can get at. So it's not only just criminal conduct, it's not only just conduct, that involves threats, intimidation, or coercion, but it's, depending on the context in which it's occurring, a sort of very broad range of bias-related and discriminatory behavior. And the AGO and the Civil Rights Division can get hands on quite a lot of that. And I think that probably will cover it for an overview. I don't know that it makes sense to get, like I said, into the weeds much more on the specific enforcement tools. And I will click through to the end. And this is me. That's my contact info.
Thank you, John. That was
Very
helpful.
welcome.
That was really helpful. Thank you. Special Agent Jacoby?
Can everybody hear me okay?
Mhm.
All right. Thank you very much, District Attorney Ryan. I appreciate you allowing us the opportunity to come and speak with your group. I think it's an important topic, and hopefully what you all will walk away with is a little better understanding on the federal side, which will be, there'll be some points similar to what Dan has already covered and what John has talked about to a certain extent with his presentation. You'll likely see some similarities, but what I hope you'll walk away with from this presentation is just a little better understanding of what is our civil rights program on the federal side. We'll talk about, a hate crime versus a hate incident versus hate speech. I won't go into too much detail because Dan has covered that. And then go over some statistics and trends that we've seen in the area here, not only within the Commonwealth, but also touching on some points that District Attorney Ryan brought up affecting Middlesex County, and then the public awareness campaign. So can everybody see the PowerPoint? Did I lose you?
No, I don't see the screen share.
Okay, hang on one second. Let me just make sure I'm sharing it. Apologies.
It's okay. There we go. All set.
All right.
Yep.
So this slide here that you're seeing is just speaking to our sub-program. So when we talk about civil rights on the federal side, hate crimes, which we're primarily going to focus on today, and then there's also a color of law component, as well as a freedom of access to clinic entrances, or what we refer to as the FACE Act. And the pie chart there that you see is basically how that plays out as far as cases that we see on the federal side. So we do see a good amount of color of law cases followed by hate crime cases, and then a smaller percentage of FACE Act cases. So I won't spend a lot of time on our definition. Full disclosure, I am not an attorney. I think Dan did a fine job of kind of describing it. It's not going to differ much on the federal side, the definition of a hate crime, than it does on the state side. But basically, what we're looking at is motivation. So a criminal offense still has to occur, but it's got to be motivated by some sort of bias for us to get to charging some of the hate crime statutes we have on the federal side. So here are just some case statistics that we see along the lines of hate crime. Similar, I think, to what DA Ryan kicked us off with. You'll see a large portion of that being race related, and then a good chunk being related to religion, and then obviously some gender identity, and sexual orientation, bringing up another good chunk, and then a mix of other issues there that you see in the graph. I won't go into these statutes too much in depth. I am going to spend a little bit of time with Title 18 USC 249, just for some historical context, as it's one of the last major laws we saw added to the books to try to help us have some tools on the federal side to combat hate crime. And a lot of the legal terminology that you heard Dan go over as far as willfulness, true threat, et cetera, we'll touch on a little bit of that, but again, that will be mirrored on the federal side. And I think it's important to note on the federal side, when we're looking at charging hate crime, we're usually going to do that in conjunction with our state and local partners. So for the purpose of this call, if something were to happen in Middlesex County where there is a potential to charge any of the violations we have on the books on the federal side, there'd be a discussion with DA Ryan's office to just figure out usually what is our best bang for the buck to make sure we can bring about some swift justice to the perpetrator. So a lot of these, tools that we have on the federal side mirror some of the statutes that Dan went over. I will highlight, before I move on, the Church Arson Prevention Act. So here out in Western Massachusetts, we did have an incident around the holidays last year where the Martin Luther King Jr. Presbyterian Church was set ablaze out in Springfield. We were able to charge that on the federal side using our Church Arson Prevention Act statute. The issue, well, that's an ongoing case and I can't get into it too much. The issue that remains with that incident is to competency. So whether the perpetrator will be deemed competent to stand trial. One statute I did want to talk about in a little more detail is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crime Act of 2009. So if you aren't familiar with these two individuals, both of them succumbed to pretty brutal attacks back in 1998, approximately 4 months apart of each other. Matthew Shepard was targeted because he was gay, was ultimately taken to a spot outside of Wyoming and left to die. They were able to find his body. He before he passed, tried to get him some care via a hospital. Ultimately, he ends up in Colorado, and 5 days after they find him, he ultimately succumbs to his injuries. James Byrd, in that same year, gets targeted because he's an African American, gets targeted by 3 white males who basically drag him behind a pickup truck for approximately 3 miles until he ultimately succumbs to that torture and dies. So as a result of these 2 incidents, many years later, we end up with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd hate crime prevention acts that that help us on the federal side bring justice to hate crime victims. And so just touching on that act in a little more detail, you'll see here what Part 1 prohibits. Going back to our definition again, we're able to detach this statute if we're able to tie it to some sort of injury as a result of discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, etc. And then Part 2 obviously deals with weapons and the circumstances surrounding a potential attack involving the statute that we're able to use. And then for us on the federal side, we've got to attach usually an interstate commerce or an interstate component to be able to meet the threshold for a federal prosecution. You'll see, I won't read that slide to you, but there's definitely, some areas that we can usually attach that to potentially charge on the federal side. Again, not to repeat myself, but these cases are usually an ongoing discussion with the state or local office, again, to figure out where we have the best hammer. Thought it'd be appropriate, and again, Dan touched on this, and I think John did too to some extent, but this one is important, and I'll get into our awareness campaign too. It was something I tried to make a point in talking about when we had our awareness campaign roll out with hate crimes. Unfortunately, for us to use some of the tools we have on the federal side, it has to have a crime associated with that bias or that hateful act. A lot of times, what we will find is folks are victims of hate incidents or hate speech, which, while offensive and obviously troubling to a lot of individuals, it's not necessarily something we'll be able to act on and apply one of the statutes we have on the federal side. So a hate crime, we've already talked about hate incident. So think of it as something equally offensive to a hate crime, but just does not violate any laws that we would have on the federal side that would allow us to charge any of the hate crime statutes we have on the books. And then hate speech, going back to, I won't reiterate what Dan has already touched on as far as First Amendment protections. There's certain instances where those First Amendment protections attach. And obviously, as Dan stated, certain instances where they don't. But sometimes some of the trends we've seen, even in the past year, on some of the college campuses where certain groups are targeted with racial slurs or offensive language, etc., being shouted at them, while offensive and not tolerable in a lot of those institutions, won't always rise to the level of us being able to charge a hate crime. And this slide just depicts some images and obviously hateful speech that folks sometimes use just as examples of things that by themselves won't necessarily rise to a hate crime, albeit offensive. But surely, knowing more of the context of what's going on in some of these instances could potentially lead to hate crime charges. So we touched on it a little bit. Again, I think Dan did a fine job of touching on the First Amendment and how it relates to the state side. Very similar on the federal side. And protections do attach if the circumstances warrant. True threat, I think, is important to touch on for us on the federal side, because we do have to hit that true threat threshold in order to charge hate crime federally. And so you'll see here on the slide, if somebody's just, merely throwing out hyperbole, or it's offensive, but not necessarily a true and specific threat, it is oftentimes difficult to prosecute based on that. But that's a discussion we would have with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I think the message to the public and the folks on this call would be, let us decide whether or not it rises to that level of something that we can prosecute, whether it be a criminal prosecution or using some of the civil tools that John just went over on the state side via the AG's office. The important part is just to make sure that folks are reporting these incidents, because what we have found on the federal side, even though statistically I think we're tracking a little bit better, is we do feel there's still a sense of underreporting out there, where folks either aren't comfortable coming forward to report a hate crime or a hate incident that has affected them. And so we really just want to serve as another entity if folks feel comfortable to contact us and report that. By all means, using your state or a local agency is perfectly fine to report it. At the end of the day, our goal is just to make sure these incidents are getting reported, and that we have, our collaboration on the law enforcement side to be able to work through some of the issues and determine prosecution, or whether an incident rises to a state or a federal prosecution. I wanted to mention the Emmett Till Act just for a few reasons. One, it provided us some funding on the federal side, which allows us to interact with our state and local partners, particularly as it relates to unsolved and cold case type matters. To me, those are near and dear to my heart. I spent significant time during my career establishing a cold case working group up in the Western District of New York, and the amount of victims and families out there that never got closure in certain instances. To me, there's nothing better we can do as a law enforcement entity to try to provide that closure and some semblance of assistance in bringing folks to justice. So I wanted to highlight the Emmett Till Act. If folks don't know about Emmett Till, I'm sure you can read about it better than this slide depicts, but basically back in 1955, he was basically accused of whistling at a white woman, then taken and brutally beaten as a result of that. And then ultimately, the folks that were responsible for that were tried and acquitted back in September. So this act is in his memory and gives us some tools and some funding to try to not only help solve cases that may have gone unsolved, but also give us an opportunity to do additional training and other things like awareness campaigns, et cetera, to try to raise awareness and get folks comfortable reporting incidents. I just threw this slide up as an example that I mentioned training. The regional conference that we had, that the folks here in the Boston area of responsibility attended, was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania this year. And it was a little bit different than our normal conferences because we were able to bring some state and local partners together with our U.S. Attorney's Office all under one roof to talk about some of the trends and issues we are seeing, and basically get the latest on the landscape of where this threat exists and trying to combat it as best we can on the federal side and in partnership with our state and local partners. This is just some examples from the awareness campaign, and really, I'm thankful for the campaign because if it's not for that, I potentially, myself and Heidi, don't have the opportunity to get on here and talk with all of you. But the main goal of that campaign is just, one, to educate folks on hate crime, two, to raise awareness of it, and to give folks another avenue to report it, and really encourage people to report, because like I said earlier, we do feel like
Antonia, can you hear? Are you frozen?
I'm not frozen. I don't think we can hear Matt. Did we lose him?
There he is. Matt, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was
That's
afraid
okay.
I got the curse, Dan. I got disconnected. Mine's frozen on me a couple of times. So hopefully I'll make it through the rest of this without losing you guys. But this is just some examples of the awareness campaign that we launched here in the New England area. You'll see buses and then nationally too, billboards, etc. Move to the next slide.
You may have to share your screen again, Matt.
Okay, sorry about that, Antonio. Let me get it back up. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's just some examples of the of that publicity campaign, and then here, just want to mention, I think we've talked about some of them, but just some best practices. Obviously, first and foremost, the partnerships with law enforcement agencies. So while we're the primary federal agency to investigate civil rights violations, very important that we work together with our state and locals, again, in collaboration as these incidents pop up, as we see things trending sometimes in the wrong direction. These partnerships are immensely important and something that we've put an extra emphasis on, not only as part of our campaign, but our outreach efforts, which Heidi will go into in a little more detail in a minute. Obviously, liaison with our community groups, talking to the prosecutors early, and we've made it a kind of a best practice to make sure we're including our prosecutors and our law enforcement partners into that conversation early. You'll see coordinate with a DT cell. So DT is our abbreviation for domestic terrorism. So if there is an ideology by a perpetrator of a hate crime, sometimes it will fall into the domestic terrorism realm, where on the federal side, we will coordinate on the civil rights side with our fellow counterparts working domestic terrorism to make sure we're applying the correct statutes and handling the case appropriately internally. And then again, just knowing the area, knowing what up here in New England and particularly in Massachusetts, and for all of you on here, Middlesex County, just knowing the area of responsibility, the groups that are prevalent there, the trends, targets, demographics, all that kind of stuff are things that we look at to make sure we're tracking. And what I'm going to end on here is just some trends that we're seeing in the Boston region, and then touch a little bit on Middlesex. So full disclosure, these statistics are from 2020. There is a tool online that anybody can access, the Crime Data Explorer. We are trying to get a little better at rolling that data out so people can explore on their own, but that is where this data is emanating from. So these trends you're seeing here are national trends. You'll see a big chunk of victims related to houses of worship, and that could be all sorts of different ethnicities. And then you'll see a population of Jewish folks that were affected, 22% African-American, LGBTQ+, and on. I won't read the rest to you, but those are some of the trends in the victim side. And then incidents. And again, there's lots of different ways you can look at this data, manipulate it, or have it relayed. This chart basically depicts the type of crime that was committed. So you'll see a big chunk being threatening communications, phone, mail, social media, Zoom, etc. Sadly, I think with COVID, while all of us would like to be in person for these types of meetings, we're here on Zoom conducting this. I think COVID has certainly played a role in folks being on the computer more, potentially having idle time to do things that maybe have spiked recently that normally we wouldn't see numbers as high, but we do see a lot in that social media communication realm, which is why you'll see 56% there. Vandalism, no surprise there with, it can be anything from spray painting to, breaking into houses of worship, etc. Arson, obviously, we talked about the incident that we had happen here out in Western Massachusetts. So those are some trends as far as the areas go. And then for Middlesex, we did reach out to our headquarters and tried to pull a little bit of data specifically to Middlesex. And you'll see here, African Americans affected 41%, Jewish 20%, LGBTQ 18%. While this one's a little different and you don't see a house of worship category, there certainly were some incidents related to house of worships. They're just not captured on this pie chart here. And then you'll see a very similar trend here as far as the types of crimes, a little different as it relates to destruction of property and vandalism being the majority there, assaults, threats, intimidations, etc., following suit there. And then some national trends, and I think District Attorney Ryan spoke to this. Obviously, we've seen some trends within the Asian community as COVID surfaced. LGBTQ plus community, for whatever reason, there's been an uptick in Black transgender females along those lines that we've seen. African Americans continue to be targeted, houses of worships, people of Jewish and Muslim faith, and then we've even seen some overseas conflicts spill into issues here in the United States, one being the Azerbaijani community. Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and then Zoom bombings. We've got those kind of under the COVID-19 related trends. Again, COVID has not been any help to any of us as far as hate crime specifically. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi Kelsch to talk a little bit about the community outreach opportunities we have here, and also some a recruiting plug. So Heidi, all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Heidi Kelsch. An admin piece, our blue line here, our internet connection seems to be freezing about once every 20 minutes. So if we do get disconnected, just have a little patience and I'll get right. It takes about 20 seconds to reset. So essentially what we're trying to do is demystify the FBI. What we do with these community outreach programs that we have is there's a lot of people out there that are aware of the FBI and what we do through the news or through movies or television, but what they don't know is how to get a hold of us. And the campaign that ASAC Giacobbe was referencing is a great first step. It gives a 1-800 number. It lets people know that we are interested and willing to talk about these issues. But we've also found that if we take it one step further and give people a personal connection to make sure that they have contact information of a single person in the FBI who can speak to them, it goes that much further. So over the course of the last 6-7 months, we've identified certain communities that we've had virtual meetings with. We wanted to take advantage of the virtual landscape. We know that not everyone has time to come into the office and sit around a table. Obviously, that's optimal, but we want to make sure that everyone's voice gets heard and that we're able to introduce ourselves and put names to faces. And so every 2 months, we hold a virtual meeting with our special agent in charge, who discusses a broad FBI perspective on the importance of diversity and inclusion, and then ASAC Giacobbe and his civil rights team present very similar to what you just saw, breakdowns of what is a hate crime versus a hate incident. And then the community outreach program talks a little bit about our programs that we can offer, the presentations that we can give either virtually or in person, and how we can get in front of different groups. We just had a meeting today with members of the LGBTQ plus community. So far, we've been able to speak with members of the Black community, members of the Asian American community, the Jewish community, the Latino community. And so we're really excited, and we're hoping it's going to culminate in an event next spring where we can bring in people from all different groups together and have an in-person large meeting here to talk about some of these issues. We're still wary about throwing out dates and times for that, simply because COVID has changed our plans so much over the last couple of years that we're not willing to commit right now. But we're hoping that that's how this is going to go, and that sometime next spring we will be able to finally hold that event. In terms of youth events, one of the things that we've noticed is that we're able to, if we can get in front of the youth in our community, it helps so much in terms of getting people interested in law enforcement or participating in law enforcement someday. The earlier that we can get in front of them, the better. So we offer a whole bunch of different programs for youth and teens. We have a teen academy coming up in February. And those things, we don't talk as much about substantive cases, simply because we're not in front of them for very long. And we've talked to them, and the feedback we've gotten is they're more interested in seeing the evidence response team do a presentation or seeing the SWAT team do a demonstration. But through that, sometimes we're able to establish a partnership with a school, and we're able to get involved over a series of weeks. And if we have more time, we're able to get into the classroom with a particular teacher and talk through some of these more challenging issues. And again, the earlier we can get in front of people, the better. So that's what we have for community outreach. And if, the best thing to do is to reach out to either me or to ASAC Giacobbe, and we can get you hooked up with an event or in line to participate in something that we're doing. That would be fantastic. Here's our contact information. If you know somebody, one of the things that we try to do as part of this community outreach is to recruit people that are going to make the FBI more representative of the community that we serve. And so the more diverse groups that we can get in hold of or in front of, we can encourage people to apply. We give them all the application information. People can go to the website. They can reach us through a generic Boston email address that goes to the recruiter and to myself. And then there's my direct email. And somebody can, if you want to get a hold of us, you can certainly email me.
Thank you, Agent. Now, I know that's a lot of information for people, but we want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, comments for any of our speakers.
I have can I jump in there?
Of course you can.
Thanks. Sorry, I look like a schlump, first of all. It's still my not quite at work part of the day. So I'm the rabbi in Bedford, and I've been dealing with a lot, and in Burlington, I've been dealing with a lot of school systems. And I have not, I think almost every school system at this point has had to deal with the issue of a swastika, which is now, I'm more and more conscious of the fact that it's a misnomer, because our swastika is really a religious symbol in Hinduism. And it should be called a Hakenkreuz, I believe, which is what Hitler reframed it as. Anyway, so it seems like every school system I start to deal with is reinventing the wheel. They don't know what to do when these incidents happen, and so it's like, so I'm wondering, first of all, if there's a way to reach out to school systems to educate them better on what's a crime and what isn't. And then I have a specific, in one of the school systems, local school systems, there was an incident where swastika was found in a bathroom, and they started to go through an educational process about it. And there was a girl in a class whose parents are both her grandparents are both Holocaust survivors, who told her whole story about being the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And after the whole discussion about what a swastika was and wasn't, and her story, a boy in the class stood up and said, "Well, I have a different opinion, Heil Hitler," and he raised his hand in a Nazi salute. And I just, and the school, the teacher removed him immediately, and the school's been dealing with him. But again, I just feel like I know these are children, these are below adult age people. So I don't know. Like, they don't want the police involved. I'm just not sure where to go with this, or what the appropriate process would be on both of those.
Anybody have
Sure. So
thoughts, suggestions?
I can start if it's helpful. So the AG's office enforces, like I said, a number of statutes that deal with bias-related bullying and harassment in K through 12 schools. I do a lot of work on exactly those types of problems in schools. And without getting into any particular cases, people can always contact either the Civil Rights Division generally through our complaint process online or over the phone, or me individually to file a complaint or draw our attention to something. So, and I think the takeaway is it's not a situation where schools should have to reinvent the wheels. The AG's office has guidance out there about what schools' responsibilities are under state law for dealing with hate incidents involving students. And, as that implies, school officials, separate from anyone else, have very specific responsibilities to address bias-related bullying, harassment, or other conduct that can create a hostile environment for students based on race, religion, national origin, and other protected characteristics. So like I said, it's work that our office does a lot. It's work that I do and specialize in. So people are more than welcome to reach out to us in general, or me specifically.
Thank you.
Other questions, thoughts? We see this all the time, obviously. It seems every day another incident or people claiming to be, given the trials we've seen in the last couple of weeks. A lot of discussion about that. I think it's hard sometimes. It's hard for us sometimes, sort of sorting through and figuring and talking through what may or may not be an incident. As I mentioned, the statute in Massachusetts has some ambiguity that hopefully
We lose Marion.
I think she got booted, yeah.
I think we might have lost her. So I'll just ask one question. If I can share the PowerPoints that everyone used, is that okay if I email that to everyone so that folks will have your contact information?
Absolutely, yes.
That's fine with me.
Yeah, no issues.
No
Just to
problem.
add one more thing on the school issue. So obviously we're dealing with these on the civil side primarily, particularly where we're talking about elementary school students. It would be unusual for there to be criminal prosecution involved. And like I talked about a lot during my spiel, for that reason, the school responsibilities are a lot more flexible than if we were enforcing criminal law, right? And the First Amendment issues that arise on the criminal side, or even outside of the K through 12 context, are very different than how the First Amendment applies to elementary school students in particular. So again, just to echo the other presenters' position, we would prefer that people report all of these things to us, even where they are potentially involving political speech or speech, and let us work through what is and isn't actionable or isn't a problem.
And I will also add that our office does the social justice roundtables that's offered It's a 4-week curriculum that we work in the high schools with students around some of these issues. One, in how they can become better advocates for themselves and ally, but also to point out how can they change the school culture or climate to address these issues. So I'm more than happy to share that curriculum with any of the schools that would like that. So in closing, I'll just say I appreciate all of our presenters today. This was just so much great information. This is being recorded, so I will share this with everyone here on the call so that you can share it with your community members or listen to, because like I said, there was a lot of good reference material. And I'll also send out the PowerPoints. Marion's up here, she comes back, and let's see, let's let her back in. But so appreciative of all the sharing on this topic. Are there any other questions or thoughts? Okay, Marion, you're on mute.
Sorry, I froze and was knocked out. As I was mentioning, the Attorney General's bill addresses some of the ambiguities in the statute, and two of the pieces we're really looking to fix are, and I've mentioned this before, the one that by a drafting error, clearly the state hate crime now does not allow someone to seek charging when they are not the owner of the property. So if I rent my home or I live in a dorm and somebody comes and puts something on the door of my house, or they do it on the public school across the street where I have to look out at it every morning, that right now does not qualify for prosecution because that person is not the owner of the property. So we filed a bill to fix that. And the other thing that the statute does not provide for, even if someone is held accountable and restitution is ordered, there's no requirement that the person who owns the property as it stands now, when it has to be the owner, that the owner use that money to fix it. So if somebody comes and paints swastikas on the public school across the street from a Jewish family so that every time they and their children go out the door, they have to look at that, and somebody's held accountable and they paid $1,500 or something in restitution, the town will get that money, but there's no requirement that they go out and paint over what's on the school. The bill that we have filed would require that the restitution be used to remediate the harm that has happened. So those are just some important changes that we had a hearing last week. They seem to be favorably received, so hopefully those will be successful. I'm sorry, did somebody else start to ask a question? No? I want to thank our presenters for being with us this afternoon, for all of that information, and thank all of you for making time. This is, I know, sort of a hectic week getting back from the holiday, but making time to be with us. Please feel free to reach out to us with questions. As I said, we're populating that map with the information that we have. You can always go on our website if you need the form or to track some additional information. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. Thanks, Antonia.
No worries. Have a great
Thank you.
afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe.